This one satellite will be able to look globally at about 80% of all the global production of oil and gas. This is where the International Energy Agency tells us you can very cost effectively lower emissions, and methane's invisible. And so having ongoing measurements is really a game changer.
Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jen Wilson. This is a podcast where we discuss people, planet, and profit. In each episode, we'll learn from world-leading experts who can help us see the future we want and our role in it. This is episode 36, The Space Case for Decarbonization. Welcome to the Future in Sound. This is a very special episode of the podcast. We have not only a very special guest, but we have a guest host. RECO's very own COO, Eric Bloom, is joining us to host the conversation today. Eric, welcome. And why don't I hand it to you to start us off by introducing our guest today?
Thanks a lot, Jen. Pleasure to be on the podcast. I'm one of these longtime listener, first-time callers to the podcast, and really pleased to introduce Fred Krupp as today's interviewee. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Fred. He's the president of Environmental Defense Fund. For those of you who are less familiar with the organization, it's a global organization that works on environmental protection. It's a nonprofit, but it uses market-based solutions to address a wide range of issues. Fred has been at the helm of EDF for 40 years, seen it grow into an organization with an annual budget of $300 million. So a really significant global player. And as I mentioned, what EDF is really known for is using market-based solutions for environmental protection. So some of the areas where it focuses on this are in the energy transition, in food systems, in resilience against a changing climate, healthy communities, and the list goes on and on. So we could spend days talking about the many transformational initiatives that you and EDF have led during your 4 decades at the helm, Fred. But today we're going to focus on 2 questions in particular. The first one is, we're in a sort of a unique time within environmental protection, but you've seen so many different cycles, whether it was, the early sort of environmental movements in the 70s and 80s, corporate social responsibility. You've seen so many cycles where the focus has, come and gone in terms of environmental protection. Priorities have changed. So we're really looking forward to your commentary on the current moment that we're in. And then we're going to focus on one of EDF's newest initiatives, MethaneSAT, which is really one of a kind and which tackles one of the most potent and poorly managed greenhouse gases, methane. So we'll discuss how EDF is working across industries to address this important source of emissions and the value and benefits to people and planet that doing so can unlock. So maybe I'll hand it over to you, Jen, to kick things off.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Well, just building off of that introduction, Fred, welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. How should we make sense of the current geopolitical moment from an environmental perspective?
Well, Jen, thank you. And Eric, thank you. It's a delight to be with you. Yeah, the current moment is very complicated, and there's a lot of opportunities, and there are a lot of challenges as well. And I guess when you're trying to change the world, you better be pretty aware of what are the dynamics, what is the current state of play in the world as it stands today. If you're trying to change yesterday's world, you're not likely to be effective. Maybe I should just back up to Eric. You gave a great introduction. I love the description of EDF that you gave. We are super interested in using markets and market-based instruments and working with business. I would only supplement that by saying we were now started in 1967, group of scrappy scientists on Long Island over the effort to ban DDT. And from the beginning, in addition to that those strong economics, we've also prided ourselves as to be really strong on science. And it's from that strong science really that the MethaneSAT, which we'll get to later, grows. But, the challenge you ask about, Jen, so far I've just said it's complex. The world is different now than it was a few years ago. There's opportunities, there's challenges. Certainly in the United States, there's no question we have a fight on our hands. We have to fight to defend the big things that we've won in the last 4 years. And it's clear now that the new administration is out to repeal a lot of both the Inflation Reduction Act sections as well as the regulations that were put in place by EPA. But even in the United States, you have to remember that politics is local, and a lot of the congressional districts that would have to vote on whether to repeal the legislation are benefiting from new battery plants, new EV plants, new installations of solar and wind. So I think all is not lost. There is a fight to be had. And I think there's now so many people that have an economic stake in the energy transition that we have a good chance not only to repel the attacks, but to continue to make progress. Around the world outside of the United States, the cost of batteries, solar, wind, lots of innovations that are critical for this transition have come way down. There's new advanced geothermal that we're pioneering in the United States. We actually pump water into hot rock and then pump it out a few hundred yards away. And so just the fact that technologies have gotten so much less expensive gives us opportunities all over the globe. And we do have companies now who understand that while these political cycles come and go, there's a long-term interest by people all over the globe to have a habitable planet. And the drive and the political support and the governmental support for clean energy at affordable prices is going to continue.
It's really interesting just looking at the business case. And I wonder, because politicization of sustainability is not new, or the environment is not new. And so when you're communicating with CEOs, for example, what are some of the ways that you communicate when things are polarized? So just taking a step back before I let you answer, Fred, we work a lot with private equity investors who want to do the right thing. And at the same time, they want to make sure that they are listening to investors who maybe have anti-ESG legislation and others who have pro-ESG legislation. They're trying to find the through line so that they can grow great businesses. And often they want to make progress on sustainability. They just want to make sure that they're not too close to one pole. So I'm just wondering, in terms of how you've navigated and communicated with CEOs and investment leaders during times where there's not political agreement, how do you get through to those audiences, maybe to give them confidence to keep moving forward on some of these important issues?
Well, Jen, as you and Eric and I have talked about previously, it's all about the business case, and EDF works to really understand the business realities for particular companies. So far, we've talked a little bit about the energy transition, and if you look at EVs, 14% of global sales were EVs in 2022, 18% in 2023. It's expected in the first quarter this year globally, these are global statistics, to be 25% of all cars sold. So I guess the point here is the business case is companies have to respond to the market, and they have been. It was Honda and Nissan that merged so that they can compete during this transition. The German auto industry is now facing what many call an existential crisis because they've been slow to respond to the demand for EVs. So companies are in a race to win the market share of EVs because EVs are just more fun to drive. They're not only cleaner, they're faster, they're more fuel efficient, they're cheaper to drive. And successful companies are going to be the ones who understand that this demand is growing. And I think consumers also are paying attention, looking for leadership. If your brand is seen as polluting the community or the climate, it's going to hurt you in the marketplace. So the business case, not always, but almost always, we find is quite compelling to companies should lean in and anticipate the future.
I guess if we put ourselves into the CEO's shoes for a second and try to think of a couple of rules of thumb during this time of polarization, you mentioned in the auto industry some who sort of are taking too long to get to a transition. Are there any rules of thumb from a CEO's perspective in terms of how to ensure that we're not getting distracted by the noise or politicization, but we're taking prudent steps in line with our goals that are sustainability related and also to grow our businesses?
Yeah, I'd be interested in your answer to this question. From my perspective, it is the CEOs who, part of being an executive is to be able to see the broad picture, the big picture, and also anticipate the future. And I guess if I had to enumerate two rules, it was, look at the big picture, anticipate the future. That's what comes to mind.
What comes to mind is the set of images that Amory Levins, co-founder of Rocky Mountain Institute, used to show. Of course, Eric and I met at Rocky Mountain Institute, and he showed the two pictures that were they, Eric, 10 years apart on Fifth Avenue, and you see one car surrounded by horses and wagons, and then 10 years later, it's one horse and wagon and all cars. So just, to your point, Fred, about seeing through the noise and thinking about not just what's the market share today, say for EVs, but where is the market growing, and keeping an eye on that, I think really resonates. Eric, I don't know if you have any other aspects of what Fred shared resonate with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and also, you've seen so many cycles of this, Fred, and those who are observers of sort of climate legislation, where, we feel fortunate that over the last couple of years, I mean, the Biden administration passed, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate bill ever. I think last time I checked, about 60% of those funds went to Republican districts. And that was by design because there's such a backlog of infrastructure and so much interest in clean energy across the political aisle. Now we're entering a phase where the private sector may have to lead rather than, government leading on climate. And I wonder if there are other, points in time, Fred, where you saw the government isn't, moving quickly enough on this. The private sector needs to sort of focus on this and really, make the business case on their own and let government sort of follow in its footsteps.
I think, there's a ton of examples where government leadership has been useful, the whole development of the internet. There's a ton of examples where private sector leadership is key. So I don't know there's one size fits all, but given the cycles that you point out, I've seen that you've seen too in the change in the political winds. I think it's a bad bet to bet that humanity is going to want to foul its own nest. I just don't. In the long run, that can't be true.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks a lot, Fred. Now, we'd like to take a look at one of the initiatives we mentioned early on, which is MethaneSAT. So, I think rightly, the climate movement has really focused over the last decade plus on CO2 emissions. But there's sort of an important other molecule, which is CH4, which I think is driving about a third or to a half of warming these days. And it's sort of been a bit of a blind spot in the private sector, in government, et cetera, because there just hasn't been clear data in terms of, the sources of methane and the impacts it's been having on warming. So I'd love to talk about EDF's role in sort of clarifying the important role of methane in driving global warming and what EDF has been doing about it. So why don't we start off, if you could just maybe sort of tell us a bit about the scope of the issue today, because I think, again, we focus mostly on CO2, but CH4 is so important. What are the sources of methane and why is it such an important issue?
Yeah, the sources of methane, the biggest industrial source is the oil and gas industry, but other fossil fuels are also a source. Coal mines, both surface and underground coal mines, methane comes from that as well. Agriculture as a whole is an even bigger source, slightly bigger than fossil fuels. And there you have, the production of dairy, livestock, largely through the mouth, enteric fermentation causes methane emissions in the burps of the cows. And also, growing rice, putting the rice stalk underwater, also can cause methane. So landfills are the other major source that I've left out. But here's the way I think about it. This year, 2025, all the CO2 that we burn from all the fossil fuels on the planet will heat us up in the next 10 years about the same amount as all the methane that comes from those sources I just mentioned. So that's pretty amazing. And two things are true about that. One, we definitely still have to work on getting CO2 down because the CO2 actually keeps working long after 10 years for all 100 years. But since the methane emissions by quantity are much smaller, if we can get them down, they're so potent in the short term, then we can actually reduce the temperatures that we would otherwise see over the next 10 years. So methane represents an enormous opportunity to cut the rate of warming, unfortunately not from today's levels, but from the levels that we would otherwise see. And that's why about a decade ago, EDF made a very deliberate decision to focus on quantifying where the emissions were coming from. And we began by looking at the oil and gas industry since it seemed to be the most tractable. But first, we needed to know how much is coming and from where.
Right. So it's really a question of data, it sounds like.
Well, that's exactly right.
Hey, it's Jen. I just wanted to take a quick moment to let you know a bit about Rico and what we do. We're a tech-enabled advisory firm that helps private market investors and companies measure sustainability metrics using our software platform. We also help you to set targets and focus your efforts on sustainability areas that really matter for your business. And finally, we help clients to translate all of this work into your core value creation strategy or your business model. Check us out at re.co.com to get in touch. All right, now back to our conversation.
Until quite recently, methane was a bit of a black box because you don't have meters, tracking emissions from leaky oil or gas wells or, from farming practices. And so really, I think my understanding is that what EDF realized was that the best way to measure this precisely was through remote sensing. And so you decided to go to space for the solution. I believe as of March of last year, EDF is operating a satellite with technology that was specifically designed to sense methane emissions worldwide. And I also believe this makes EDF the first nonprofit to be operating a satellite. So tell us a bit about the MethaneSAT program, what it aims to achieve, and the impact that you're looking to have.
We started off about a decade ago measuring methane on the ground, and we got thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of measurements. We took 10,000 measurements just above oil wells in the United States alone. We used airplanes, we used drones, we used handheld, and oftentimes the companies were cooperative and gave us permission to go onto their land and measure methane. But after getting tens of thousands of spot measurements, we realized that we could much more cost effectively get ongoing measurements from space. And thus the idea of MethaneSAT was born. We announced it in 2018 in Vancouver at a TED conference. And as you say, took a few years to design and build and launch, but we did launch on March 3rd of 2024. And the idea is that this data, because the reason, Eric, as you said, there weren't meters measuring methane until we really raised this issue up, and methane's invisible. And so having ongoing measurements is really a game changer. This one satellite will be able to look globally at about 80% of all the global production of oil and gas. It'll have the capability to look at other things too, whether those are coal mines or landfills. But we're starting for the first while the oil and gas industry, because this is where the International Energy Agency tells us you can very cost effectively lower emissions. So that is going to be the first couple of years of MethaneSAT's journey.
Thanks for that explanation, Fred. And, coming back to EDF's unique role in this, you have huge oil and gas majors around the world. You have government bodies that have been looking at, environmental impacts from different types of greenhouse gases. Why do you think no government body or industry player or group was able to do this before? And why is this sort of the perfect example of the leverage that organization like EDF can have in sort of creating this foundation for companies to get data, to better understand their impact and begin to take steps to address some of the issues of methane worldwide?
Well, government space programs have been slow moving and expensive. And, now we have private companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Labs, and others that are showing that the private sector can build rockets and satellites much less expensively. But those companies are paid to launch instruments that serve a private sector purpose. And here, just the fact that the Environmental Defense Fund saw that without knowing where the methane's coming from and how fast it's leaking and who's responsible, we don't have the data. We don't have the data even to tell the companies, where it's leaking if they want to clean it up, which many do. And so, we decided it was a good mission for philanthropy to commission a spacecraft that would do exactly that. And the data that we're getting, is going to help policymakers. It's going to help industry. It's going to empower people all over the world to see in a very transparent way how much methane is leaking from where. Because the IEA tells us we can reduce 2/3 of methane in the oil and gas industry without any net cost. This really is low-hanging fruit to have a big impact. And one role that EDF has played is not only to raise the $88 million that was needed to build and launch the satellite, but also to talk to industry about how, we want them to get ahead of the game. We'd like to catch them reducing methane emissions. The goal here is to reduce methane emissions, nothing more. And so I'm happy to say that at COP28 in Dubai, Dr. Sultan rallied 50 companies, it's now 55, who represent today 45% of all oil and gas sales, to make a pledge to reduce their methane pollution by 90%. So yeah, half the industry has pledged to reduce their methane pollution by about 90%, and not by some 2050 faraway date, but by 2030, right around the corner. And when we launched an accountability effort with the United Nations Environmental Program and with the International Energy Agency, the IEA, it was welcomed by the CEO of ADNOC and the former president of COP28, Dr. Sultan. Welcomed because he wants the industry to fix this very fixable problem.
If it's okay with you, I'd love to butt in, because I'm just really interested in the nuts and bolts of, how like 50% of the industry has committed. Fred, how did you go about starting at a human level those conversations and getting the industry to sort of come around this initiative and support it? Like, how did you seed that? How did the team at EDF seed that idea and get buy-in from the industry?
Well, I think the first thing we had to understand is the oil and gas industry is composed of a lot of engineers. And the way to an engineer's heart is through data. And so from the beginning, even when we were using handheld flare cameras to measure methane, we found that once we shared the data with these companies, they understood the problem, they could see the problem then, and they were, motivated to fix it. And I think just on a human level, you mentioned, Jen, approaching them in good faith, assuming they were going to act in good faith, giving them a chance to react to the data. Our central goal was not to embarrass them. That wasn't really a goal at all. The central goal is just to reduce emissions. And so in every conversation we've had, we approach people with the respect that every human being deserves and with an explanation. All we want to do is solve this problem. And we've been able to build strong allies in CEOs who might not agree with us on everything. We want to move away from oil and gas just as quickly as we can, and certainly from carbon dioxide emissions. And so they might not agree on that, but at least they can agree that methane pollution as a byproduct, as a very potent greenhouse gas, needs to be eliminated. And we recognize that we are going to be using oil and gas here until all of us stop driving cars that run on gasoline and heating our homes with natural gas.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful, the way that you're able to communicate the benefits of this to CEOs, Fred. Maybe building on that, I wonder if you could maybe discuss some of the benefits of this sort of reduction in methane. I imagine it's things like, these oil and gas majors are saving money through reduced wastes. Are they getting ahead of regulatory actions? Based on the data that you are generating at EDF, how is that kind of changing the game in terms of, the business case for all of these oil and gas majors to cut their methane emissions so dramatically?
Well, there's a couple of things I'd say. One, there is payback for a lot of the emissions cuts, not all of them, and the payback is pretty fast for the majority of the things an oil and gas company has to do to reduce emissions. They might not make as much money as drilling another well, but it's very cost effective, very low cost. In many cases, in most cases, actually 60% of the time, according to the IEA, there's no net cost. So that's part of the business case. The other part of it is to understand that their whole license to operate, like any neighbor, is to be a good neighbor. And that when you reduce this greenhouse gas, you're also reducing a contribution to local air pollution and smog. And so, that's part of the case as well. In countries that have regulations like the United States, Canada, European Union, part of the case is to stay ahead of the regulations in the home countries. And then increasingly we're seeing, and the environmental defense is very much part of this, we're seeing countries wanting the fossil fuels that they import produced cleanly. And so the European Union adopted last year a rule that says not only should the oil and natural gas produced in Europe be produced cleanly with a minimum of methane leaks, but also by 2027, just a couple of years from now, they're going to require disclosure from what is the methane pollution associated with the LNG that they're importing. And then by 2030, they're actually going to impose a standard that has to be met for their imports. And so part of the business case for producers today is to get ahead of that. Similarly, in Japan and Korea, there's an initiative called CLEAN. It's a voluntary initiative put together by the major importing companies of LNG, and they are also, moving to impose a standard that the production needs to be done in a way that is responsible and clean, which, the industry itself is now defined as 90% lower than current levels.
Is it fair to say then that the data that MethaneSAT is generating is going to be sort of underpinning a lot of these regulations? If you have to, for example, prove that natural gas from a particular source has, limited, emissions, is the data for MethaneSAT going to be one of the main sources to verify that, in fact, that well wasn't leaking significant amounts of methane?
Yes. The MethaneSAT is the only instrument up in the air or plan that can give us comprehensive totals of how much methane is being emitted, because we can see very, very small leaks that unfortunately in many cases are leaking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it turns out, at least in the United States, that it's those small chronic leaks that make up the bulk of the problem. Now, these are plumbing fixes. There could be a leaky valve that needs to be replaced. Could be a hole in a plastic tubing that needs to be replaced. So the good news is they're not expensive to fix. But the fact of the matter is that, in some basins, they represent up to 88% of the total that's being released. And they are largely invisible to other satellites and other ways of measurement. So MethaneSAT data will be available to the jurisdictions that are now moving to require clean production.
That's incredible, Fred. And so it just really shows the importance of data in clarifying the scope of the issue, clarifying where companies can actually take action on this, and supporting robust regulatory regimes to actually reduce methane in the long term. And now I know we're getting to the end of our time here, but I have one question I'm just dying to ask, which is, how do you launch a satellite? Do you just, do you call up NASA? Do you call up SpaceX and say, hey, I've got a satellite, it's ready to go into orbit? Like, how do you actually do that?
Well, the first thing we needed to do was find somebody that knew how to do it. And so we hired a guy named Tom Ingersoll, who had built 2 private sector companies and sold them. Very successful founder and CEO of a couple of companies. The last one he sold for $500 million. And so he ran the design and build phase of this project. And we did put out, once we knew how much the satellite was going to weigh, we put it out to bid, and turned out SpaceX had the capacity to launch this at the lowest cost. And, then we went about getting Blue Canyon Technologies and Ball Aerospace, that has since merged into BAE Systems, to build both the bus and the instrument. The instrument is now up in space. It's performing better than spec. We've begun to release the data on MethaneSAT.org. And as soon as our data factory is completed, which is the automated algorithms that are turning the raw data into something easy to interpret, within the next few months, we're going to release a flood of data on all these sites around the world. Each of the areas that we look at, they can be as large as 200 kilometers by 100 kilometers. And we're releasing this data for free. Anyone with access to the internet can access it. So that's 2/3 of the people around the world. And it is going to be a game changer, not only for citizens, Eric, but also for investors. They're going to be able to figure out which companies are conducting their businesses in responsible ways and therefore likely to be more durable, and which companies haven't cleaned up and likely to run into problems either from authorities in their own country or from the importers that increasingly are demanding fuel produced cleanly. So that data is going to be available to the financial community. And I think that'll be really important for private equity investors to have access to that so they can understand their own risk. And ideally, it'll raise the cost of capital to those who are lagging behind.
Well, thanks a lot, Fred. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks for taking the time. Anything you want to add, Jen, before you wrap up?
Just that I so appreciated the comments today, your leadership, EDF's leadership. I too cannot wait to check out MethaneSAT, and also the comments about really focusing on the problem at hand and showing respect to others, even if they have different views, and really galvanizing folks with different points of view toward a similar problem. It's really inspiring, Fred. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on The Future in Sound.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Eric. Take care.
The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jen Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a tech-powered advisory company helping private market investors pursue sustainability objectives and value creation in tandem. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And if you have a moment to rate us in your podcast app, we'd really appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for listening.